All right. So for our last presentation of the day, we have Halima presenting recommendations for silvicultural practices to support species at risk and enable managed forests to qualify as OECMs. She'll tell you what that acronym stands for. The work is supervised by John Caspersen and externally by Tanya Pulfer with Cambium. And I think Tanya is with us online.
Hi, I'm Halima, and I'll be examining whether managed forests have the potential to qualify as OECMs. To start off, I want to briefly introduce a matter of considerable debate integral to my project, land sharing versus land sparing. This boils down to, should we set aside area for conservation, or should we integrate conservation and production on the same land? Before we get into that topic, I'm going to go through a brief background. I'm sure we're all aware of the current global biodiversity crisis we're facing, as many of us are confronted with staggering reports, such as the IUCN reporting that 1 million species are currently at risk of extinction. These reports have been a growing focus for global environmental policies since the 1980s and has led to the creation of organizations tasked with addressing it, such as the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. This convention is responsible for crafting a variety of frameworks aimed at halting biodiversity loss, the latest being the coming Montreal Biodiversity Framework, consisting of 23 targets designed to protect nature and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. Canada is one of the countries that has committed to the coming Montreal Biodiversity Framework and has since focused on one of the more ambitious targets, Target 3. Target 3 consists of protecting and conserving 30% of Canada's land by 2030. Currently, this is the wrong presentation, but it's fine. Currently, only 13.7% of Canada is conserved. The reason for this low number is that Canada has a few challenges with classifying traditional protected areas. The first being that Canada is has a very vast landscape, with many being in remote and barren areas. And for an area to be classified as traditionally protected, it must have the ability to be monitored and managed. The second challenge is that Canada has a lot of land tied up in other primary management, and for an area to be classified as traditionally protected, it must have conservation as its primary management. To solve this issue, Canada must look towards different land sharing initiatives. OECMs, or other effective area-based conservation measures, offer a promising solution to this issue. OECMs are defined as areas that have other primary management, such as set-aside areas, military bases, or research facilities, but still provide similar conservation value as seen with traditional protected areas. For example, the Canadian Force Base Shiloh in Manitoba experiences significant human activity, such as equipment testing and operations on its land, making it unsuitable for strict protection. However, in other areas of the base, they prioritize environmental stewardship and effectively manage numerous species within their lands, making them eligible to be included in the 30 by 30 initiative. Currently, only 0.9% of Canada's terrestrial land is designated as an OECM, as the formal definition was only established 2 years ago, and its government organizations are currently exploring a variety of different land uses to expand these areas and contribute to meeting its 30 by 30 commitments. So this summer, I worked with the ECCC, which is a federal government agency responsible for identifying and recognizing OECMs across Canada. They often collaborate with other organizations, Indigenous groups, and NGOs to help establish these areas. This summer, they tasked me with assessing the potential for forests managed under Ontario standards to qualify as OECMs. Before I go into my methods, I'm going to give a brief review on the current state of forest management in Canada. Canada has seen a shift since the 1990s away from the harmful practices associated with the forest industry and has since embraced ecological forestry. Ecological forestry goes by many names, and it basically boils down to managing a forest in a way that simultaneously manages for timber and conservation. This method A key component of ecological forestry is natural disturbance-based management. This method shifts away from the timber-focused management, such as plantations, that lead to simplified integrated ecosystems, and instead ecosystem management is implemented to emulate natural disturbances and restore natural forest ecosystems, increasing the forest resilience, complexity, and overall diversity over a long period of time. So when forests are managed using these principles, they have the potential to support ecosystems long-term, conserve biodiversity, and therefore have the potential to be recognized as OECMs. So my project was to examine how well do Ontario forests manage these Ontario forests managed under the Ontario standards mimic natural disturbances. I focused specifically in Ontario to have a manageable study area. I specifically focused on official provincial forest types that were defined by the Government of Ontario. And for this presentation, I will be using tolerant hardwoods as an example, but I did similar reviews for each of these forest types. I then, for my analysis, did a literature review on the standard silviculture practices in Ontario and what's often recommended and how often they're practiced. Following that, I did a review on how well these practices emulate natural disturbances and the limitations of these practices to see if they have the potential to meet OECM criteria. Lastly, I used species at risk as an indicator for biodiversity. So these are the current management recommendations within silviculture guides in Ontario. For this presentation, I will be going through the first three columns, and I will examine the effects these management have on the overall landscape of the ecosystem. This chart is specifically for tolerant hardwood forests. So single tree selection is often the most recommended as it establishes a lot of target species such as sugar maple and beech within this forest type. Group selection and shelterwood are also often recommended for more light-dependent regeneration within the stand, as they generate a higher level of disturbance, allowing mid-tolerant species to colonize. For single tree selection, the methods of management allows for a lot of species at risk to have habitat, such as the Acadian flycatcher that requires a shaded environment, or the American ginseng that requires low disturbance rates. For the group selection and shelterwood, they can effectively manage for species that require high light levels, such as the wood thrush that needs open space for nesting, or the black-throated blue warbler that benefits from significant shrub growth. The last group selection and shelterwood effectively, group selection and shelterwood both have the potential to alter the forest structure of the stand and establish a more diverse understory than found within single tree selection. Many of the guides do include the need to incorporate important habitat structures to support numerous species within the forest, such as snags and deadwoods. These practices are found to support key species at risk, such as the little brown bat, which requires roosting structures within the forest. They also discuss buffers around sensitive areas such as riparian zones. While many of the recommended silviculture methods have shown success in conserving specific species, when looking at a broader landscape scale, it becomes easier to rule out those that effectively do not mimic natural disturbances. Single tree selection first creates low light levels with the uniform removal of trees and can cause numerous downsides such as low regeneration, low heterogeneity, and most notably the loss of ecological legacy, which eventually can create simplified degraded landscapes. While single tree selection was, because of these reasons, single tree selection is most notably not suitable for OECM classification in a landscape scale. While single tree selection was not suitable for mimicking natural disturbances, the other two methods, when modified, do have the potential to effectively emulate these disturbances and conserve the overall ecosystems of these forests. For example, group selection has been shown to foster a more diverse regeneration and greater heterogeneity compared to the single tree selection method. And by creating canopy gaps of varying sizes, group selection also allows for a broader range of species to regenerate, including mid-tolerant and shade-tolerant species. With a few modifications, such as soil scarification, as well as diversification of deadwood, such as a range of decay classes, as well as retaining legacy trees, can further promote the regeneration of these ecosystems and provide long-term in situ conservation of biodiversity. Similarly, modified shelterwood, when incorporating natural disturbance emulation practices such as variable retention harvesting, as well as the ones I've already mentioned, can have a similar impact in effectively conserving biodiversity within these forests. Although single tree selection on a landscape scale is unsuited for OECM classification, it does not effectively mimic natural disturbances. It can be applied on a stand level to promote heterogeneity within the forest, as well as support critical habitats such as those used by the American ginseng that requires low levels of disturbance. So what's next? While current standards often fall short of what's typically required for long-term in situ conservation of biodiversity, there still is potential when looking at managed forests that go beyond Ontario standards as potential areas to look towards. Organizations such as the Eastern Ontario Model Forest that partner with various industry and government organizations to promote sustainable forestry can be useful in identifying these areas of interest. Another potential avenue for locating potential OECMs is examining Indigenous managed forests. Indigenous forest management practices are often more likely to incorporate natural disturbance-based management. A notable example is the Menominee Nation's land in Wisconsin, USA, where sustainable forest management has been practiced for generations, and they often incorporate traditional ecological knowledge within their forest. They have moved away from the common single tree selection management methods and have since embraced management methods that mimic natural disturbances, such as gap dynamics and variable retention harvesting within their forest. In Canada, Indigenous communities manage a growing number of sustainable forest licensing, accounting to about 7% of total licensing in some regions. These forests often integrate traditional ecological knowledge as well, and which can align with the ecological forestry principles that I've discussed. As such, they may represent strong candidates for evaluating the potential of managed forests to meet OECM criteria. Lastly, it's always a good question to ask, is this the best method to go about looking for potential OECMs within managed forests? While land sharing is essential, there can be alternative methods that have the potential to incorporate both land sharing and land sparing at a stand level, such as the triad method. This method involves sectioning a forest into 3 quadrants, where one quadrant is conserved and the other is intensively managed, demonstrating land sparing, while the other quadrant is managed extensively, so managed similarly in a way that I've discussed in the guides, demonstrating land sparing. This method is used to optimize land use, concentrating management towards certain areas, such as plantations, while ensuring that sensitive species have designated habitats free from disturbance. As previously discussed, many silviculture methods, such as single tree selection, have demonstrated success in conserving specific species. However, when viewed from a landscape scale perspective, it becomes apparent that not all methods effectively mimic natural disturbances. So when using a triad method, incorporating target management, such as single tree selection, can still be applied at a stand level to promote heterogeneity and support critical habitats, such as those required by species like the American ginseng. So in conclusion, as Canada moves more towards ecosystem-based management, managed forests do have the potential to be recognized for their ability to conserve biodiversity long-term. However, when identifying OECM candidates, it's essential to focus on areas that go beyond current management standards to effectively conserve biodiversity, as these areas will be essential to meeting Canada's Target 3 commitment goals. I'm gonna go through a few acknowledgements. Sorry, this is not the updated slide, so I spelled your name wrong, John, but I'm gonna say thank you to my external supervisor, Tanya, and my internal supervisor, John, as well as the internship coordinator, Sally, and a few of my professors at UFT, as well as my coworkers at the ECCC. Their valuable insights and encouragement have been essential in the successful completion of my project. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're joined by Tanya, who's online. Tanya, do you have any questions?
Sure. Halima, that was a great presentation. And really good work on sort of looking at different practices that may align with biodiversity. As you know, OECMs are biodiversity is just one of the requirements for an OECM. Mm-hmm. So looking at permanence as one of the criteria, what sorts of things besides biodiversity, what sorts of things do you think we would need to look at? You had some suggestions there of Indigenous-led conservation and working with EOMF. What sorts of other things do you think we should be looking towards for the permanence and the biodiversity together?
Mm-hmm. You're probably gonna have to look towards forests that don't have industrial scale harvesting within their forest, as they might have too much conflicts with their management. You could look towards research facilities, university properties, as well as municipality forests or other forests that don't require a lot of intensive harvesting.
Okay, and that's because
They might
that's,
have, sorry,
no, go ahead.
they might have a better chance of doing these management methods long term, as they don't really have a lot of the same economic downsides as you would have in a more industrial scale forest.
Okay, and also with the permanent, they're held by organizations with
Yeah.
long-term goals. Is there any other sort of long-term goal that you can think of that is in a managed forest that could possibly, like in terms of, say, certifications or anything else?
I definitely didn't look towards this from a project, but I remember sitting in
Mhm.
a few conversations at the ECCC. I think they're working with FSC to look at their set aside areas. They are making designated conservation lands, and those could be included as OECMs. So expanding that to include model forests might be beneficial as well, or signing permanent easements as well that make sure that these managements is occurring in these forests can also help towards this.
Yeah, and I really like the focus that you had on private lands as well as touching on the public. That was really great. And yeah, you've really hit the nail on the head in terms of some of the challenges and difficulties within the managed industrial forest landscape. So good job.
Thank you.
That's all for me.
Hi, Halima. I was interested in your kind of last minute mention of triad as a kind of an overall approach that may or may not align with kind of the OECM screening process in the sense that OECM are meant to be distinct from protected areas, whereas triad kind of combines them into one approach. So if you were recommending to include triad in the OECM kind of screening process, how would you deal with the fact that protected areas are supposed to be sort of handled separately, whereas triad suggests that they are sort of incorporated, together? I'm not, let me try, let me try to elaborate my question a little bit better. So, in the screening process, there's protected areas. So wouldn't that sort of result? So protected areas are supposed to be handled separately from OECMs. But if you picked a landscape that was managed under triad and proposed it as a OECM, wouldn't that somehow lead to sort of double counting or yeah?
I get it.
Yeah.
I've only really touched on the biological criteria for an OECM, but there are also governance criterias, and most of the governance criteria say that for protected areas are mostly managed under the government. So if a forest license is doing a triad method, since it's happening within the same area as their other forest management, it wouldn't meet the criteria of protected area because it's not owned by the government and they're doing the management themselves. So it'd be more similar to a set-aside area that is included in the OECM criteria rather than be included as a protected area. So, yeah.
Okay. So that would avoid double counting. What about the kind of opposite problem, which is that triad sometimes includes, kind of by definition includes intensive management and may in some cases include, say, plantations, which are sort of anathema to, some potentially to conservation. Would that present a problem if OECMs included, like worst case scenario, some kind of intensive plantation management?
I've definitely thought about this. I might not be the best person to ask for the exact requirements for every part of the landscape, but I do know that there are certain target numbers for how how much the area has to be managed in a way that's ecologically beneficial, I think it's above 70%. So if, let's say, 70% of the forest is managed in, is conserved and managed with extensive management, then maybe the entire area could be included. But if that's not the case and there's a lot more plantations, then you probably would only be including the conserved areas and the extensively managed areas. So it's probably context specific.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? How
Ready to go
about
home?
any online?
Yay.
No?
We go
Okay.
home.
Oh, yeah. Okay, there is one question.
Great presentation. I learned a lot. Is there anything going on internationally that gives us any insight into what we could be doing? Is there any?
OECMs definitely are a big deal internationally right now. I did as much research as I can, but I couldn't find a completely managed forest that is classified as an OECM globally. So this is definitely new territory, but you can look towards other areas to see other management areas like agriculture to see what the requirements are.
Okay, excellent, thank you.
Thank you.